This week, we're talking to a superstar of Canadian journalism. Steve Paikin is joining us. Steve is one of the finest broadcast journalists in Canada. He is a longtime host of the TBO public affairs show, The Agenda. He has found his way into the living rooms of perhaps millions of Ontarians. People from outside of Ontario will know him as the guy who moderated the English language leaders debate for the federal election last month.
This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto.
My guest this week is Steve Paikin. While the agenda is drawing to a close, Steve is quick to point out that he's not really retiring. He's more like rewiring, and he intends to pursue a number of other journalistic pursuits, including podcasts, maybe a newspaper article, maybe another book. So he's got a lot going on. Steve, welcome.
John, good to be with you.
Your background in television journalism is something that I think makes for a fantastic opportunity for me to turn the tables, to have to ask you some questions for once. And one of the things that I'm always curious about is the role of a journalist in being tough but fair and getting to the issues at hand. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps share a story or two or offer your thoughts on what it means to be tough but fair. You could even use the leaders debate from last month as an example.
You know, it's funny. Whenever people ask me these kinds of questions, I almost don't know how to respond because I don't necessarily... I'm not sitting on the outside watching me do this and therefore able to kind of analyze how I do what I do. I'm in it. I'm doing it. And I don't know that I really spend a lot of time anymore. I presume I did at the beginning as I learned how to do this. I'm not sure I spend that much time anymore understanding what I do and therefore able to describe it to other people. You know, the fair part of what you just said is far more important to me than the tough part. I've never really felt a need to portray some big macho tough guy who asks the tough questions and gets the hard, I know there's some people that see journalism that way and they feel the need to be very macho and peacocky in the way they ask their questions. I've tended to take an approach that was taught to me many years ago by a guy named John Sawatsky, who was a professor of journalism at Carleton University. And he said there were some very basic principles that you should follow when you're doing an interview. You should ask neutral, lean, open-ended questions. Absent of hyperbole, don't ask double-deckered questions. Do you believe this or do you believe that? Maybe they believe something else and not just the two options you gave. That kind of approach has always been the way I've tried to do things. And sometimes I succeed and sometimes I fail, which is why for so many years I wanted to keep doing it until I finally got it right.
Okay, well, I think you're doing a pretty good job of getting it right. We had a conversation a while back about the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And I don't know if you recall what you said when I asked you what your view was on the distinction. And you said, you thought about it for a while, you ruminated, and you said, I don't know that I've got a good definition, but I know it when I see it.
That's the Potter Stewart line. I stole that, of course, from Potter Stewart, the former Chief Justice of the United States, when he was asked what pornography was. But I mean, if you ask me today, I think disinformation is a knowledge aforethought attempt to deceive people, whereas misinformation is more along the lines of just getting it wrong. That's what I say today.
So that is an important question for me as I try to do my job as an advocate for investors, because I believe there's a great deal of misinformation being promulgated by financial advisors, and they're not doing it because they're nefarious. They're not doing it because they have ill intent. They're doing it because they honestly think they're doing the right thing. They are spreading misinformation. They are parroting and repeating things that are false that they nonetheless believe to be true. And I guess I'm having trouble getting the industry to recognize its own willful disinformation in getting financial advisors to see things a certain way. The advisors, of course, unwittingly spread misinformation because they're accepting the disinformation that the industry is foisting upon them. What advice would you give to someone like me who's trying to get the industry to recognize its own flaws and to come to terms with them? And I'll caution you, part of the problem, I believe, is that the industry doesn't want to come to terms with them because they're fat and happy and making money the way things are. And so they'll tell a good story about how they want to do what's right. But in the end, not much changes.
I think you've come on TVO, 2 or 3 times anyway, to have this discussion with me. And I think the last time was when you had your book out. And as a result, you've turned the tables on me here. And of course, I'm not in the business of giving advice. You are supposed to spend a lot of money giving it to very expensive consulting companies who will come up with plans to tell you how to answer that question. John, this is a very unsatisfying answer, but that's not my business. I'm really not in the business of giving people advice on how they ought to handle the vagaries and the disinforming inclinations, as opposed to the misinforming inclinations of the world they live in. I'm a question asker. My job is to get to the bottom of things, and I don't pretend to know enough about anything to be in a position to advise people on how they ought to handle things. Short answer is keep at it. The longer answer is if you're trying to roll a rock up a very, very steep mountain and you're the only guy trying to roll that rock, the mountain's probably going to win most of the time, unless something cataclysmic happens in the world to change the way people think about this stuff.
And I guess that's what I'm admitting to you, is that I feel that I've been engaged in a Sisyphusian task for a long time, trying to push that rock up the hill and not getting as much traction as I would like. And I think part of it is because even the people who purport to be on my side are giving me what I believe is lip service, because in the end, they are reporting to oftentimes corporate stakeholders that have millions and in some instances, billions of dollars at stake. And they're just simply not motivated to be as transparent and forthcoming as they could be. And that's just frustrating for me, and also frustrating, I think, for consumers who are perhaps getting less of a good deal than they otherwise could be and should be getting. And unfortunately, they don't even know it. Like, they don't realize what they don't know.
In my line of work, it really matters whether you are disinforming or misinforming people. If you're just getting things wrong, I can deal with people making mistakes, which they do all the time. If you are, with knowledge aforehand, trying to disinform people, if you're knowingly giving them bad information in the hopes that they will make decisions for nefarious reasons, that's a horse of a different color and much worse. Do you make the distinction as well?
Of course I do, yeah. So let me, maybe instead of dancing around it, I'll tell you what the evidence shows so that we know what we're talking about. A paper came out in late 2016 called The Misguided Beliefs of Financial Advisors. This is peer-reviewed with just thousands of people in the data set. So it's robust, it's unassailable in terms of what it's discovered. And what it found was that Canadian mutual fund registrants, not necessarily securities registrants, although not necessarily not, but they only studied mutual fund registrants, had three things that they were doing that was wrong. They were chasing past performance, they were not paying attention to product costs, and they were running concentrated positions. Now, all three of those things are demonstrably, unequivocally wrong, and everyone in the industry knows it. In fact, many people that are not in the industry know it. But the problem that the researchers uncovered was that mutual fund registrants not only did this and the advice they gave to their clients, but they also did it with their own accounts, and they even did it after they retired. So it's not a question of misplaced agency. They actually believed what they were doing. So the question then becomes one of, well, is this misinformation and disinformation? And in my view, and this is something I talked about in my previous book, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry, is the industry has found a way to socialize these registrants into thinking that things that are untrue are actually true. And a lot of the reasoning seems to be based in social psychology and conformity, peer pressure. So once everyone else in the office acts a certain way, then these other registrants also act in a certain way, and it's normal, and it's become the way things are done around here. And a lot of the people that are doing it don't even realize that what they're doing is contrary to the interests of their valued clients that they purport to be representing. So the problem is twofold. It's disinformation as it goes from the industry to the registrants, and the registrants pass it on as misinformation to their clients.
Does it matter at the end of the day? Is it a matter of significant importance to you at the end of the day, which it is, knowing that the outcome is not what you want regardless?
What matters is the outcome. You can call it what you want, but solve the problem. And the concern that I have is that the research came out in 2016. It's almost a decade old. And as far as I can tell, regulators and industry stakeholders are doing nothing to rectify the problem that is plain as day in front of them. And so that's the problem that I have as an advocate, is like, even when you identify the problem, even when there's smoking gun evidence that this is a problem that's out there, the industry will say, oh, we're doing other things to educate our registrants and do other things to protect our valued clients. But in the end, they're not solving the real problem. It's mostly lip service. So anyway, that's something that I wanted to get your take on, because I'm curious. As you know, one of the things I do is I also went to Carleton, and I also have a background in politics and public policy. And part of why I'm talking to you is because of policy. A lot of people in finance talk about the president that we have south of the border in terms of politics and they would talk about capital markets and what's going on in the stock market as if they are separate things, but they don't really connect the two. So here's where I'm getting at. Everyone knows that these Trump tariffs are going to be around for a while, and everyone knows that they're having a negative impact on the economy. But when people talk about the economy, they talk about the economy. And when they talk about Trump, they talk about tariffs and whether or not there will be a trade deal. I'm not seeing a lot of people in the finance industry doing what I think a good journalist should do, which is connect those dots and say, and as a result of these tariffs, we've already had the GDP contract in Q1. And the textbook definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction. And virtually every economist I know says the economy is going to get worse in Q2 because the tariffs were only announced on April 2nd. So it's going to be worse. But seeing a lot of journalists talking about how we are now almost certainly in for a recession, which is one thing. And then as a first derivative knockoff effect, that the economy and the stock market is likely going to take a hit. Now, the stock market and the economy are different things, but they're related. And I'm not seeing a lot of that. And I'm wondering if you could just weigh in. And I understand that you're not a finance journalist, but if you could maybe speak for the mindset of journalists in general, why do they compartmentalize the economy and the politics and not combine them?
Believe it or not, and I know some people don't believe this, we don't all, as journalists, be it Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, True North, Rebel Media, we don't all get together in a room at the end of the day and sort of conspire as to how we're going to present information to the public the next day. It just doesn't work that way. I don't know about you, but I certainly have seen reportage which says we got a recession coming. You're not the first person to tell me this. I've read it in publications. I've heard it on television newscasts. Maybe you're saying I don't hear it enough, or maybe you're saying I don't hear it on enough different media outlets. I don't know. I can't really speak to the decisions that other places make. Certainly we have had shows on the agenda on TVO that relate to our economic progress under Trump's tariffs and trade war, or lack thereof. And, I'd like to think that we're sort of making whatever modest contribution we can to the public's better understanding where we're at right now. But I always have to take a bit of an issue with a question that starts, journalists in general say, or they are reporting that, when we're all, pretty different people reporting in different ways, looking at different inputs, providing different outputs, and at the end of the day, appealing to, in most cases, pretty different audiences. I don't see this sort of monolithic brand that your question presupposes, I think.
Okay, so again, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anyone, so that's not my point. My concern is the connecting of dots is the way that I like to put it. So people are talking about a recession, and I'm agreeing with you on that. I think there's a lot of people in the media that are talking about there's going to be a recession. The knockoff effect is that when there is a recession, there's usually also a bear market. So we should be preparing for a bear market. And one of the things I talked about in Bull Shift is that when you see things coming that are not certain, but probable, and that you have a reasonable chance of anticipating what might be coming down the pike, you would probably be well advised to stop, reflect upon what you're doing, make sure that it still makes sense, and if need be, make adjustments. And the concern that I'm trying to express, and maybe I'm not doing it as eloquently as I could, is that I'm not seeing as much of that as I believe there ought to be, either from within my own advisory brethren, but also from the media. People are just talking as though, well, the economy might be in recession, but I'm not hearing people say much about, but have you really looked at your portfolio, and is your portfolio designed still to weather a storm that most people think is likely to come? And of course, that's not a guarantee, but it seems probable. And I don't see many people saying, prepare for something that seems to be probable.
Well, okay, I'm looking at the same information you are, I suppose. And I'm seeing under Trump's imposition of tariffs on one day, companies lose $6 trillion worth of value. And then, 2 or 3 weeks later, he claims to be having an agreement with China, and suddenly the market goes up 1,000 points in one day. So God bless you, John, if you can figure out what's going on. And God bless you if you see any rhyme or reason behind what appear to be very arbitrary decisions taken by that administration, and then the concomitant reaction by the markets. It seems to me that we are in a period of just complete and utter chaotic decision-making, I mean, your job obviously is to respond to the conditions that you've been presented with, which I presume you're trying to do to the best of your ability. But as you and I sit here talking right now, tomorrow, the province of Ontario will unveil its annual budget. The Minister of Finance, I don't know how he does his job. I don't know how you're supposed to present a document that with any degree of specificity can tell us what the deficit is going to be in the next fiscal year. How can he possibly know that? Well, we don't know if tariffs are going to be 10%, 25%, 50%. It depends what side of the bed the president appears to wake up on.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say, Steve, is that things are so fluid and so hard to know that the fact that things are that unknowable and that chaotic is of and by itself a cause for concern.
Sure.
And that the norms and presuppositions of the way the economy works are out the window. And everyone agrees that the economy is more volatile and that stock markets are going to be more volatile in both directions.
We are reporting that, aren't we, John?
We're reporting the volatility, but I don't know that people are looking at it's as though it's volatile today. But I'm not as sure that people are, and maybe it's just my impression. We just have different impressions. My impression is that there's not enough being said about, and this is going to continue, and you should be guarding against that because it's likely to get worse.
I don't know. The Prime Minister says it all the time. You know, this also may just reflect the fact that you and I are consuming different media. There are myriad voices out there, everything from the most ancient legacy media to brand new stuff that's popping up to some smart aleck on Twitter who thinks he knows as much as the next guy. So maybe a lot of this depends on what we're actually reading, seeing, and hearing.
Okay, so let's talk about the new prime minister who you've had a chance to meet and who you've had a chance to interview. And both you and I have read his book, Values. And so it's the sort of thing where I think we have a pretty good sense of what he's about. And I can tell you that I personally feel comforted that he has a background at global finance and that he's able to better navigate what's likely coming down the pike, accepting that no one knows exactly what that actually means or looks like, and that Canada is actually fairly well positioned for that. So notwithstanding the fact that I was just saying I'm lamenting how maybe people are not as concerned as they ought to be, on the other hand, I would also say that I think our political leaders are better prepared than most political leaders in other parts of the world to deal with whatever it is that we're likely to be experiencing. Wonder what your thoughts are.
I would agree with that. And I'll tell you, Canada, for all its faults, provided the public with, as it turns out, because 85% of the people voted this way, two very starkly different choices for whatever they thought ailed the country at this particular moment. If you just said, under normal circumstances, I got an idea. Let's take a guy who's never run for anything ever before, who has a name recognition in polls of probably 5 to 10% of the population. He's been out of the country, actually, for several years because he had a job overseas in which he was completely, out of the attention of the Canadian public while he was over there. And we're going to get that guy during the worst, most unpredictable time of our recent lifetimes, and we're going to make him the leader of our party and then run him for prime minister the next day. You would say, you're nuts. That's a terrible idea. That's a completely ridiculous idea. The guy just hasn't got the experience. And conversely, if we said, we're going to take a guy who's got 20 plus years of experience on Parliament Hill, who has been thinking about what he would do as prime minister since he was a teenager, who has an intimate knowledge of how Parliament works, and has been such a successful opposition leader, preparing himself to be prime minister, that he actually managed to get rid of his chief competition and the most controversial policy that his competitors have advanced, you would say, well, that sounds pretty good. Sign me up for that guy. And yet, interestingly enough, Canadians made a different choice. It was close, but they made a different choice. The biggest chunk of Canadians went for the guy who had no political experience at all, but they did see those two things on his resume, which were kind of important at this moment, right? Governor of a central bank of two G7 economies. And people were prepared to turn a blind eye. I guess enough people, 43% of the people were prepared to say, all right, the Liberal Party's record over the past 10 years is less interesting to me right now than this guy's qualifications. The fact that he doesn't know his way around Parliament at all is less important to me right now than his knowledge of how markets work and how economies work and how we can get out of this. And as much as we have liked this other guy over here, Pierre Poilievre, whom we gave a 25-point lead to when Justin Trudeau was still prime minister, we like him, but only so far. 41% of us liked him enough to vote for him, but we like him only so far considering the emergency circumstances we find ourselves in right now. This, to me, is what made this election so fascinating to cover, because we had such starkly different choices, and people who cared a lot about Trump, tariffs, and trade the most voted for Carney, and people who worried about the affordability of their lives in Canada at the moment voted for Poilievre. And it's a very close election. And I think it was, how far back do you have to go? You may have to go back to the 1940s to find an election where the Conservatives and Liberals so dominated at the expense of all the smaller parties in a way that they did on, what was election day? April 28th.
I have one more major question, then I want to ask my generic wrap up. As you know, my concern is that Canadians in general and investors in general are largely whistling past the graveyard. And you've been pushing back a few times already at what I've been saying, so you might not even accept what I'm about to say, but I'll tell you anyway, because I feel that I'm sometimes a voice in the wilderness. I believe the world is experiencing a unique situation, the likes of which has probably never been experienced before, where we have someone who is the leader of the largest economy of the world, the largest military of the world, who is siding with an autocrat when he attacks other nations, who is throwing all trade deals out the window, and who seems to be not only a wannabe autocrat, but also a kleptocrat. Throwing the world economy into disarray and driving the global economy into the ditch. That is a risk to investors that I would argue has never been experienced before in all of recorded history. My view is that we are still too hubristic and too naive about the risk that we're being exposed to right now. Maybe because people have become so desensitized and what Trump does has become so normalized as to not think it's a big deal. So part of what I was thinking about when I wrote Bullshift is I was concerned about the industry shifting people's attention to making people feel bullish. And that's usually just, it's all fine here, nothing to see here. But I never thought it was going to come to play out like this, but I always thought there would come a day when it would play out in some capacity. And that is that the world is riskier and the industry is not doing what it could and should, in my opinion, to ring the alarm bells to get people to take some maybe proactive prophylactic steps to protect their portfolio. And partially they do that because it's good for business to say, hey, things are fine. Don't worry. Take a long-term view. You're going to be fine. And by blindly going about the way things have always been done, a lot of people might be unwittingly taking more risk than they otherwise might. And again, the concern that I have is that the industry should be more proactive in ringing those alarm bells. But maybe I'm Chicken Little. I don't know. You tell me. What do you think?
I'd push back on a few of the words that you just used there. I don't know that anybody is, I think the word you used was blithely going about their business without noticing that in the United States, for example, their 401ks over the last 6 weeks have been worth dramatically less than they were. I'm sure there are a lot of people who had to delay their retirements because they didn't have the money that they thought they'd have to retire. I know there's a guy who owns an electric car company in California or Las Vegas or wherever it is in Nevada that they make those cars, who was the head of the Department of Government Efficiency for Donald Trump, who suddenly realized that most of what he valued now had half as much value as it once did. To me, there have been lots of alarm bells that have rung. I've certainly been hearing them from here. It certainly seems to me that when your billionaire friends, if you're in the White House and you have the billionaire class on your side, and the billionaire class is coming to you and saying, come on, man, we got to rethink this. We're taking an absolute hammering out there. That may have something to do with why Donald Trump one day put 100% tariffs on China or 125 or whatever it was, and 2 days later announced that he had an agreement with them. So you are certainly well within your rights to look at the facts as you see them and come to one conclusion. But I'm not sure I'm seeing as much of a lack of interest or as much blithe response to what's happening right now as you suggest.
All right. Well, there it is. I think it might be that we do travel somewhat in different circles, and that's part of it as well. So my last question is, the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions, and we can talk about decision-making in a number of different ways. But for you, it doesn't have to be a wealth decision. It can be a political decision. It can be a career decision. What advice would you give to the listeners to make better decisions in general, and if possible, better wealth decisions?
Well, I always start from a position of get empirically provable facts. That's the business I'm in, and it informs basically everything that I do. When I sit down to do an interview, unlike now where you're kind of talking to me, when I sit down to talk to other people, the purpose of that conversation is to get empirically provable facts from people and to advance them myself in the pursuit of those empirically provable facts. I remember having had a conversation with a politician whose name I probably shouldn't mention because this story will embarrass them. They were part of a panel discussion on our program, and somebody else made a point, and this politician responded by saying, well, they may have the facts on their side, but here's what I believe. And I interrupted the conversation to say, oh, wait a second. If that person's got the facts on their side, then it doesn't really matter what you believe. They win. They win the argument. I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe that if somebody advances empirically provable facts to a decision-making process, then that's the person we have to listen to. And if you've got an opinion that isn't based in fact and is only based on whatever it is that you want to base your opinions on, well, it's not that important to me. That's what I do. If I were offering anybody advice, I would start with garbage in, garbage out. You can't make good decisions if you're taking bad information in. Get the best information, the most empirically provable facts you possibly can, and from that, potentially, can emerge good decision-making. Doesn't always happen, but at least you've got a shot at it, I think. One of the things I guess we've learned over the last little while is that if you're the president of the United States and you are making decisions which appear to have no basis in rationality or thought or understanding of how markets or people or economies or whatever will react, well, then the likelihood of your getting a great deal of buy-in from the general public and a good result on the other end is pretty slim. I think if we're running an experiment, we've kind of proven that over the last 3 months. So maybe we ought to try putting good information into the decision-making machine and seeing what comes out the other side. It's a novel approach, but you never know. It could work.
Well, and it's certainly one that I espouse as well. So one of the things that I always say is the one thing that I'm offended by is I'm offended by people who are offended by truth.
Right.
And so I'm simply, trying to tell things as truthfully as I can from my perspective. Steve, I want to thank you for your time today. You're such a shining light in the Canadian industry, and it's a pleasure to know you, and I want to wish you all the best.
John, it's very kind of you, and I happen to know that you and I both share a particular affection for a particular hockey team, so let's just say, go Leafs go.
Go Leafs go.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.